folks. Yeah, all right. Got some fans in the crowd. I like it. So today, we're going to be talking about data center infrastructure management software. And I want to say a few words about the project. About 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, Scott Killian, myself, and a couple other technical staff members of the Uptime Institute, Chris Brown, took on the task of trying to assess the DCIM market. The Uptime Institute typically hasn't been a product assessor, a product company. We thought that this was something that we needed to do for our organization to really try to understand this market better. And we've done extensive research. We've surveyed close to 1,000 data center operators. We've spoken to a half dozen of leading vendors in the space. We've talked to a lot of their reference customers. We've spent a lot of time in the last 6 months trying to understand it. And I have to think that our personal experience is a lot like the personal experience of the folks who are going out there and trying to buy DCIM. You've got a team with a day job that's not buying DCIM, trying to find out who's going to be a good fit, whose technologies are going to work for you. And I'd like to say that we have the answer. And we'll find out if we do or we don't. We have an answer. We have an answer, and we have some questions that you need to ask as you approach this process. I think that'll help you do a better job if you are in that 70% that's looking to buy DCIM or considering it or hasn't bought it yet. Some of the things that we've found may help you if you've already bought DCIM. Try to get some value out of it. So just to provide an overview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to present some of the industry survey data. What have we found from the roughly 800 respondents so far? We're going to look at the DCIM providers, their products, the customers, and what do the customers say? What do the folks who have bought these products and ostensibly are happy with them, or they wouldn't be reference customers, have to say about their experience? Why did they buy it? Why did they pick who they picked? But a big focus is, what is the ROI? I think that this echoes Julian's presentation from yesterday, that the 60% of respondents don't think that saving IT money is part of their job, that there isn't a focus on ROI. If you don't have ROI in mind into a DCIM purchase, you're not going to get it. If that's not part of your process going in, you're not going to get ROI. And I feel like a lot of folks are focused on just getting it, putting it in place, and not thinking about what that return is. And then lastly, we're going to invite Scott Killian up to talk about a recent project where we had a customer who was trying to make a decision about DCIM. If you remember the comments yesterday about the minivan, I didn't want to buy a minivan, but I had to buy a minivan. This was one of those cases where they had a CIO who wanted DCIM. They had an availability requirement that made them want to buy DCIM. They had to buy DCIM. They wanted some help figuring out which one they should buy, or helping them with their decision, understanding and rationalizing that decision to their budget holders. So Scott's going to talk about that process. So we saw the slide yesterday. This is the market penetration. This is what we see and we feel is credible. 27% have already purchased some kind of commercial DCIM. For the folks that haven't, why not? What are the barriers? For the co-location vendors, a lot of them already have something in place. So they've already have sophisticated monitoring tools, sophisticated space planning tools, fairly sophisticated chargeback tools. So if you're a co-location provider and you're not buying DCIM, it's because you've already got a lot of this stuff that's being rolled up into this DCIM shorthand. For the enterprise, it's cost and it's return on investment. Again, the cost isn't just the price of the software, it's also the staff time. So for the enterprise organizations and for the vendors in the room, this is your challenge, to help these folks build a case and to build their business plan around DCIM to be more cost effective and to provide that return. So this is one of the things that shocked me initially in the survey and proceeded to continue to shock me as we talk to folks and the reference customers. So how long do you spend just kicking the tires? 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. Just 6 months. Most of them spent 6 months, and it was longer. Anecdotally, I can tell you there are folks who've been kicking the tires for 2 years on DCIM. That's a lot of staff time. I mean, I feel like we've spent a lot of time on it, just trying to understand what the vendors offer. So that's a lot of time and effort for your staff. And let's say you decide, let's say you sign on the paper. How long do you take to get you up and running? 6 months. So that's 12 months on average, 12 months. You can get a new site built in 12 months. To do a DCIM product deployment, 12 months. And we've heard up to 5 years. Somebody who's had a DCIM deployment running for 5 years, and they say, yeah, we're just kind of scratching the surface of what it can do. 5 years. It's a lot of staff time. So this is the other problem. 37% of the folks who bought DCIM are trying to cobble a solution together from multiple vendors. I spoke with a gentleman from a large financial organization yesterday, and he was saying that, he's looking at DCIM, and he was looking at multiple vendors. He says, it sucks, but you have to do it. Okay? So the DCIM vendor that he's looking at, one of them, he says they have 10 modules, 10 different things that they're selling him. He wants 3. Okay? But he also really wants this thing over here from another vendor. Now, if you can convince the guys in blue to integrate the guy in red, great. But if not, you're your own systems integrator now. This is your job every time you upgrade to make sure these things work together. Do you want to be in that role? So we showed here approximate cost of your DCIM services. We've done this in the past, and I think the main takeaway is there's no value assigned. You can see here just all across the board. And I think the vendors would say, well, there's different features and functions, there's different sizes, it goes by the node, it goes by how much you're monitoring. Okay. But what this tells me is there's no value assigned in the market. That there's no, what's the price? I mean, so let's talk about it, just running shoes. How much should a pair of running shoes cost? $75, $103. It's not $75,000 to $750,000. Also, if you go out and buy a pair of running shoes, it's not going to make you any skinnier. You've got to do the work. And the scary part is you could probably get skinnier just running in your old running shoes. So unless you have an ROI in place, and unless you understand the value of your DCIM, you're going to overpay. We had an anecdote that we just discussed a customer that was in negotiations around DCIM, and the pricing went from the start of the negotiation to the end to half. They cut it in half. That pricing volatility guarantees you're going to overpay. So, do you expect a return on investment? A short-term return on investment in DCIM in 2 years. This is survey data. Co-location, 57%, a large percentage say yes. It's tied to their business. They can see a short-term return on investment. They can charge for it. They can have it part of their marketing plan. They can use it for chargeback and for better management. This is something they can write off. This is tied integrally to their business. For the enterprise, 17% see a short-term ROI. And I would argue that's because that's not a target going into these projects for the enterprise. They need to be able to target ROI. And 49% can't justify any ROI. It's just not there. So, again, this is the challenge for the folks who are getting ready to buy DCIM and for the folks that are selling DCIM to try to tie that together. So we see that that's something that needs to be fixed. And I want to address some of these are a little like an eye chart. These are a lot of text here, but I just want to point out some things. So which DCIM features or modulars are you currently using? And you can see there's a lot on environmental monitoring and alarming. There's a lot of facilities functions here that ostensibly you were already doing. And The functions here that could drive the needle, that could help you with ROI, that could help you better integrate your business, do cost analysis, underutilized servers. These are some of the lowest things being used. So we're buying tools that do what we already do and not chasing some of these more advanced, business-driven DCIM functions. Again, just to continue to hammer this home, what are you integrating with your DCIM? Your building management systems, of course. Are you integrating with your financial tools? No. Are you integrating with server management? No. Anything that could drive better business, again, we're just replacing what we already have and not kind of focusing on what could drive your business forward and save you money. Why did you buy it? Better capacity planning, better visibility into your assets. What were you doing with this the last 10 years? You're not doing it to do chargeback. You're not increasing utilization of servers. You're not looking to reap financial savings. And I argue that these are the things that you should be focused on if you want to get an ROI. So these are very low in why are people buying them, what are they doing with these tools. I argue that this is why there's very low ROI, because you're replacing existing systems with new systems that cost a lot of money and not taking advantage of the advanced function. So I guess the response is, don't be this guy. Right? Are we spending $500,000 in 18 months trying to integrate something you've already got in place? Don't be this guy. So I want to jump now to the DCIM providers, just do a quick overview of who we talk to and their customers. I'd like to say that what's going to come next is going to be a detailed analysis of each tool and what their strengths and weaknesses are and how each thing works or doesn't work. Because that's how we started that in mind. That's what we started this project thinking we were going to provide. And that may be in the final report, right? It's going to be a book by the time that's done. And we've got a lot of this data. We've collected a lot of this data. And we've looked at the tools. We've done the demos. But what we really had to scale back on, and this is illustrative of that, I had a slide from my colleagues at 451 Research. And it had just a bunch of the different vendors and what their strengths and weaknesses were across different features and functions. And I said, can I use this? And they said, no. Why? Well, because people will throw chairs. It's just too much. They don't like it. The vendors don't like it. Okay. Also, it's wrong. Somebody lied to us. How do you find that? Before you're in a pilot phase, how would you ever find that? I don't care how many demos you do sitting at your desk or how many times the sales guy comes and fiddles with the knobs on his laptop. How do you find that until you're in a project phase? So we're going to keep digging at that and trying to uncover that, but it's going to be really hard to find. So what we thought would be the most effective for this presentation would be to talk about how their customers talked about the purchase and what their customers were doing with the purchase. So realizing that there are over 60 vendors in this space, these are the folks we spent some time with. CA, Emerson, Fieldview, Enlight, Panduit, and Schneider. We had in-depth calls with their senior product managers. We did demos, and we spent quite a bit of time talking to each of these companies. And as this progresses, we may be including more into kind of the final output of this project, which is taking longer than I thought it would take. But essentially, these are the folks we picked. We feel like this is a representative sample of the market. So CA gave us 2 reference customers to talk to. Both co-location providers, just very different in their size and kind of where they are in their market. And they both, when we first talked to them, they said, well, we really wanted to be able to see visibility of underperforming facilities assets. We wanted to be able to look at the old equipment and make sure it worked. But when you kind of scrape that away, their main purchase driver was for using the tool as part of their co-location business. It's part of their strategy. It was for customer availability. It was for chargeback. They were doing marketing with it. It helped them get to contracting faster. So it was tied to their business. And the other thing that both of them said that I thought was really interesting was that they had meaningful relationships with senior execs at CA. I thought that was a very powerful thing. I've heard horror stories from data center operator who says they had one vendor with an army of sales folks, and they had no idea what they were talking about. They had no idea what the product suite included or how it didn't include, what it didn't work. In this case, they got to talk to the CTO. They had a relationship with the CTO of this business division, and that worked for them. That gave them the assurance that they were going to be on the same page. So that was an interesting part of that conversation. And one of the things that they both said was you have to take an incremental approach to this. And this is really important for that ROI, I think, for them and for anybody who's considering this kind of project. Given that the benefits of DCIM could be wide-ranging in a whole host of things, but you can't really buy that better business practice, right? So just take a chunk. What is a small goal? What is a small thing you want DCIM to be able to provide you, right? And assign a value to that function. Assign a value to whatever that small thing is, and that's your budget. That's your price. You can go with that small goal. This is the thing we wanted to do. We can expand out beyond that, but that was their advice. And this is advice from multiple folks we talked to, is come in with a smaller piece, whatever, a definable goal that you want to pursue. And that's a good way to assign a value to it. And then you know whether or not you're overpaying. We talked to Emerson, a customer with a very large university. They had high-performance computing. They had a medical center. They had their own enterprise apps for an educator. They'd had Aperture installed for about 15 years. Coming to the end of the line of that, they thought it was time to upgrade. They saw a price break, less professional services fees if they just stuck with Emerson, and upgraded to Trellis. So they were looking at it not from ROI. They had no ROI expectation going in. And I said, well, that's troubling. But again, they had a lot of the things in place that I think positioned them well for going forward. So they'd aligned their IT and facilities management teams a couple of years ago. That's a big key for them, to be able to get some value out of this, to get more value out of this. They're still just using it for moves, adds, changes, but they have a roadmap. They have server utilization tracking in their project plan. That's something they plan to do. And despite the fact that I was somewhat alarmed that they hadn't really considered what the ROI on this purchase was, they said it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. We see this as the same level and kind of investment as our physical infrastructure. It's going to last us 10, 15 years. We've got time. And they had the management structures in place to eventually take advantage of that. So they're better positioned than a lot of folks. But again, they didn't go in with that ROI, but I think they could get there. I think they could get that value out of their buy decision. And we talked to a FieldView customer, large utility provider, conservative IT shop. They were just now moving off the mainframe into a distributed computing model in a legacy data center. And they had serious availability concerns. This was a complete shift in how their compute infrastructure worked with their existing site infrastructure. Their main use was being able to do real-time monitoring on the equipment and be able to do the capacity planning, but they really wanted to make sure that the old facilities equipment could handle the new computing dynamic. And a big part for them was they didn't want somebody that came from the vendor community. They didn't want somebody, well, from the vendor. They didn't want somebody who came from the infrastructure side. They wanted somebody who was more independent because they had a lot of old gear in different kinds. Somebody who could focus on making these machines talk to each other. And they had what seemed like a pretty simple roadmap, right? Because they knew what they wanted. They didn't really even look at other vendors. They just said, we need this. FieldView could do this. We wanted to get it. And once they got into it, though, the implementation took over a year to get a bunch of these legacy equipment that the manufacturers weren't even around anymore, to get them in the reporting. So their requirement, big requirement, was they needed to be able to pull data from legacy hardware. And we heard this not just from these guys who were in a specific situation where they wanted to get availability. We heard this over and over again. We needed somebody who could really pull the data from our legacy hardware. Okay. Now, I feel like that's an overemphasis on that function, right? I know that this is getting these things, reporting into the system is going to be really important. But if you're going to spend all this effort, if you're going to spend all these months of effort trying to get these things to work and not focusing in any way, shape, or form on kind of the IT or the business value that this can deliver, what were you monitoring this for 15 years before with? And if you weren't, that's a whole different management problem that DCIM isn't going to fix. So, again, I think there's an overemphasis on this side of a purchase. So we talked to a lot more customers, and for the sake of this presentation, we're not going to be able to get to all of them because there were some interesting stories, but some common practical DCIM buying triggers. What were the reasonable reasons to go out and buy DCIM right now, to invest incrementally? And for a lot of folks, it was availability. Availability is job one. That's trumps ROI in a lot of cases. So if you need it to stay online, that's why you buy DCIM. For example, another reason would be to take back wasted capacity. If you're in a site that's 5, 10 years old and you can see on the horizon you're going to run out of space and you know you've got a way to come recoup that, to bring that back. We talked to folks who were in that kind of position, some financial firms who said, I can do ROI on DCIM. One of the few that we talked to, I can get ROI on DCIM by recouping capacity, by showing my boss and my budget holders that I can go clear out some space in the data center and get some capacity back. Absolutely. The other big buying trigger is if you can tie it to your business or IT strategy. If you're looking to implement chargeback and you can use DCIM to do this, great. It's going to drive your efficiency through the roof. If you're a co-location provider and it's part of your business to be able to have more transparency for your customers and have better planning, to be able to get to market faster, absolutely. It makes a ton of sense. And then lastly, and this is some folks we talked to at this event, and this is a thing that I've seen in the field on tier certification tours when I've gone through. If you have a new data center, it's a great time. It's a great time to do that. If you're building a new project, if you don't have to spend 18 months trying to integrate 15-year-old PDUs, if you've got a new project, that might be a good time to do that. So these are all practical DCIM buying triggers. But the main thing I want to just try to emphasize here is that you need to have a vision of a return on that investment. You need to have that in mind, because if you don't think about that going into the project, you're never going to get it. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Mr. Scott Killian from the Uptime Institute, and Scott's going to talk about an organization that needed to buy DCIM, and for a couple of business reasons. One, the CIO wanted it. Two, they're high availability organization. That's a big part of why they bought it. So, Scott, I want to talk through that for us.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. As Matt said, I'm going to give you a real-world example. Someone who came to us and expressed an interest and a need in really trying to navigate through this world of DCIM. As you'll see, they've got a lot of tools, a lot of hooks, a lot of things, and their objective was to make sense of it all, because they're being driven from the top down to do so. It may be a little bit, some of it may be a little bit contradictory to what Matt was saying, which is kind of interesting, but this is a real-world example of how someone wanted to go through the process and the need they had. So the company, global building material supplier, tier 3 certified facility, roughly less than a megawatt of critical load, desired to improve beyond data center design implementation in facilities, currently evaluating DCIM tools to better serve its IT technology, which is an important point, because that's really why they were doing it. They really wanted to get more into the IT side. They really wanted to really experience more of that side of that business. As Matt said, that seems to be one of the drivers that we're finding. And so we conducted a little workshop. We went there, visited the site for a couple of days, ran through their infrastructure, looked at all the tools they were using, talked to them about what direction and justification they were really trying to achieve, where they wanted to go with the whole project, and really what the outcome wanted to be, or what they wanted the outcome to be, so we could understand what their needs were. So the targeted outcomes, they really wanted an enhanced experience of what they pretty much presently already had, so to speak. And as I said, it was driven from the top down, from the CIO perspective. And the main thing to take out of this is that the dashboard display was really the thing that was most important to them. They really wanted to aggregate all of their key performance indicators in one place, some place that they could really focus their attention to, some place where all the business could see as well as their IT and data center staff could see, areas where they can improve, where they want to make gains, and they really wanted to use that as the cornerstone of the system. And that's what we're finding is a place where a lot of people just want to start. They have all these other tools. They want to get to a point where they can aggregate that one display, that one dashboard that really highlights where they want to go as a business or as a company. As I mentioned, they had various existing tools, the typical BAS, BMS, mechanical control tools, a separate electrical switchgear monitoring tool, engine generator tools that were monitoring and controlling, and they had various other DCIM parts. At least that's what they were called at the time. They had some capacity planning module. They had a network tracking tool, and they also have a computer room a tracking tool as well, and a security system, which it was not really included as part of the analysis, but just to show the vast array of all the different makes and models of things. And I think this is pretty typical of your infrastructure and your data centers as well. If you already have an existing data center, you have a ton of different things doing monitoring, controlling different aspects of your data center, and that's really the challenge, I think, for most DCIM vendors, is to come up with that way to very quickly and seamlessly, well, maybe not as seamlessly as we all think, but come up with a quick way to aggregate and integrate all those into something that is meaningful and some overlying product or some overlying offering. So what we basically decided after going through this for a couple of days and looking at what they had and analyzing all the tools was that there was a pretty easily defined, I should say, or pretty simplistic or pretty relative roadmap to them that we kind of recommended they should follow. And this may seem intuitive, but it really is something that I think hits home for a lot of you, is that this is kind of what we see as typical. Again, a lot of companies with existing tools, their main focus in the beginning is trying to come up with a way to integrate into something that's meaningful, that dashboard, that display, something that highlights their KPIs, takes a relatively short period of time. I say relatively, let's use the term like 6 months type of time frame, something that can really be and really show value, as Matt said, show that return on investment. So the integration piece, we think, is a typical phase one type of approach that a lot of companies can really look at and really strive for. And that's, I think, is one of the challenges. As Matt said, there's a lot of tools out there that really need to integrate, all the parts need to work, and that's people have seen that to be a very big obstacle, a big hurdle to jump. But that we still think is the need initially for a lot of us in the marketplace, is to come up with a way to really do that integration piece. And then once you do that, the desire we found was, okay, now we've got this integrated, we really don't want all these older tools if we can avoid them. How do we start to slowly migrate off of them, get to something more modern, get to something that really works maybe more transparently? So the second phase really became adding tools, adding something to look at utilization, adding something to deal with how we can get to a chargeback methodology. You know, this will take maybe the next 6 to 9 months after the first phase, maybe a year. That's still undetermined, but it depends upon the complexity. But really start to migrate off of all the little things that they have adding up and get to one similar, one very good, one or two very good tools that really have that all integrated. So you kind of drop a lot of that waste on the back end from an older tool perspective. And then the third phase, which is really what they really wanted to get to, and what the CIO, I think, ultimately wanted to get to, was to really show value to the business by being able to charge back the data center costs and all those operational IT costs back to the business units. And he felt that the feeling was that the only way they're ultimately going to get there is to implement some sort of tool like this, so they can so everything can be automated, so they don't have to manually dig into this and manually do all the stuff they need to do. And this, getting to this third phase was probably 18 months to 24 months down the road. It's that type of an approach. So it's not a short haul, but we're finding that, at least in a number of people outside of this case study as well that we talked to, this seems to be the challenge. It's how do I integrate? How do I show value? As Matt said, maybe I start small, and that dashboard seems to be the small leapfrog point that a lot of people are focusing on. Then start to really weed out a lot of the older implementations and start to migrate them into that newer product that they've now got a dashboard framework of. And then the back end, really start to show value to the business with that chargeback approach and some other, and really highlight that return and the value that the data center and the operations bring to the business. So I think ultimately you'll find that this is a typical roadmap that you may be able to use or take back to your facilities as well and your organizations as well to get the best value out of the product. So the conclusions, there were some that we found, and as kind of Andy was saying in his earlier keynote, we do see a need. There definitely is a need for DCIM, at least in the modern data center world, we think, to really get to the point where you know it's the only real way that we can see that you can really show value on a bigger scale where you have all this data. There's no way to really do it without something that's really more automated. And the starting point, however, as I mentioned, is this dashboard. And it's something that I talk about a lot when I talk to customers and talk to clients. If you can get that dashboard as your first item that you have out there, something that really shows that value, shows the value you're bringing to the business, has business drivers in there as well you can compare to, has utilizations, has capacities, has whatever your business driver is included there, and you can show the trends and improvement. This seems to be the key, and I think this is where initially DCIM can really fit in and really a place where you can get started as a company. And I think it pays out if you can work through that in the beginning. And it also seems to make sense from most of the customers that we've spoken to, and that's the way they kind of leap into this game, so to speak. Oh, and I think that's it. So we wanted to make sure that we did leave enough time for questions because we think there are probably going to be a lot of them. So now's the time for you to ask those.
Hi, Edward Hennigan, Data Foundry. I was wondering what y'all thought were the core KPIs, or the most basic KPIs that everybody should be looking at, and then what other KPIs that maybe people weren't looking at but you thought would be worthwhile to be investigating and using.
Okay. Yeah. We actually had come up with a core kind of list of KPIs, and we kind of break it down into segments. There's an IT portion, which from my perspective, since I'm kind of partial to efficiency, as you can understand, we think some of those core KPIs from an IT perspective and operation perspective are driven around utilization, whether it's server, network, storage. Then we feel there's also a good cost component you ought to have in there as well on the dashboard, that whether it's tracking operating expense solely, which seems to be a good metric that most people usually follow, but we also think you ought to be comparing that to whatever is the business driver in your organization. So it's cost per member, as an example, from I think from a Kaiser Permanente perspective. I think that was mentioned before as maybe that's one alternative, or cost per KW is a good one to start with. Also, so you can kind of see trends, kind of see it that way. So that's kind of cost. That'd be the second. Then the third area we look at is something from a sustainability perspective, because everybody wants to worry about sustainability. So just know your total cost of carbon and your total carbon output is another good one to look at. And then finally, we think you ought to look at something in the computer room from a space perspective and a capacity perspective, whether it's rack fulfillment, some sort of percentage of how you're filling racks or something like that, or KW per rack is another good one we like to monitor as well. So I think that's kind of the generic set. Have I found that everyone's looking at that? Oh, and then I'm sorry, from a fifth piece, it's the facilities, the typical facility number, which would be PUE, WE, things along that nature, something that really tracks your facility capacities as well. So we have not seen anybody that's doing all of that, and which is fine. I think you just need to get started. You need to really look at what's important to you, and to some people maybe it's just facilities and cost, or IT. I think there always should be an IT component in there, so I'd like to encourage you to do that if you're not. But probably the place to start would be IT, and facilities and cost is probably the three to really get jumped on. And everyone should have those numbers. It's not something that's really hard to come by. Does that answer your question?
Hey, Scott. Jeff Davis from AOL. So Matt, you guys mentioned that it gives back, tools give back wasted capacity and increases your availability. Can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, how does it actually give you wasted space and wasted capacity back?
Okay. Most of the suppliers and vendors have a capacity planning type of module that will, from the standpoint of, it'll look at that unused space and capacity and how you can utilize it better. It just highlights it. It's typical to what at AOL we used to look at from a stranded capacity standpoint. It'll look at that and it'll highlight it more easily than you or that anyone that's just looking at a couple of metrics or screens could do. So it kind of has that intuitive nature. We found it actually will look at that stranded space and actually come up with suggestions or have ways for you to that kind of plot through that. So I think that's kind of one of the advantages that we see from that it actually will do that. Yes and no. Yeah, it's something that I think we're finding, at least I found, that there is some integration time, and this is, as Matt said, there is some time to really, for them to actually get involved with you and actually do that and make sure that it works properly. So that's a very good point. It's kind of time dependent. It's really what you get in, what you put in is what you get out, so to speak.
And to answer the availability question, some of the customers we talk to are using it from the standpoint of watching equipment performance, but also doing dependency mapping. So, knowing what's attached to what. So that would seem to be part of the availability question.
Thank you. Question to Matt. DCIM is a very good tool, and all the discussion from the past 2 days and from your presentation, there's always focus on efficient IT, server capacity. My question is, can we drive also the focus more about energy saving? Because I know the CFOs will really understand the dollar sign. So if we show them energy saving, I think this will be a good business drive to drive more to implementation and deployment of DCIM. Thank you.
That's a great comment. And so one of the stats from the survey, we asked, are you seeing a return on investment around energy efficiency? And about 45% of the respondents said yes, that they could show some type of efficiency gains, that they could charge that, they could assign a value to that back. So, and that's a very good comment. To be able to do that is going to be the way to get your next DCIM deployment funded.
No, I would agree, and it's all about cost, right? So whether it's saving on energy or saving on labor, saving on space, which in turn means saving on capital, I think that's really the thought, that's what DCIM's supposed to expedite for you, help you do. And I think, as we said, it's been a hard sell to get people to get on to do that. So,
Scott, and I don't want to precede anybody's questions, but you spent some time with the ROI calculators that the vendors had given. What was your take on that? How credible were those, and what did they show you?
I liked them, actually. I think the vendors have done a good job. I think they could do a better job, though, of making them available, because you really have to go through the sales team to get to them, which is part of the drawback, right? I mean, you have to, it's not something you can just go out there and find on the web and actually dig into. You have to actually, which to some of us, when I was a data center operator, we kind of dreaded going through salespeople to get to things. So we'd rather be able to do things ourselves. So they seem to be fairly credible. They may inflate the savings a little bit, but I mean, that's kind of expected. But you just have to understand with a grain of salt. Very flexible in the leverage you can do and how you can plot through things. And the one thing I found, though, is that none of them will show you what the DCIM will cost.
Yeah. Try asking that question, too.
Yeah.
On the example project, where does that project stand? Has it been implemented? Has it been a success?
It's in its infancy stages. We just did the analysis and just presented the report here recently. So the step now is that they're looking into speccing, coming up with an RFP type of scenario to actually move forward. You have to understand also that since they did have a lot of DCIM vendor kind of tools, some of those tool sets are made up of DCIM vendors, slightly maybe different scenario in that they're maybe targeting one or two potential suppliers because of that, but ultimately they really need to make sure that the supplier they ultimately pick from the phase one perspective can integrate easily. And that's really the driving factor. That's the question they really have to dig into and make sure that works as painlessly as possible. So nothing we have right now. Maybe next year we can report back and give you some more feedback. But I think it's really in its infancy stages based on the report we just submitted.
Hi, I'm with a company that is a colo and a cloud provider, and we've been using DCIM since 2007 for internally. But some of the questions that I'm looking at is, what have you guys seen as far as enterprise or companies that are going to the cloud or going to colo, what are they expecting in DCIM that they can utilize through their providers?
I think that's just starting. I think that making that available is just now starting. And I don't know if it's something that was customers demanded it so much as the co-location providers were buying it and then finding a way to externalize it. I think some of the vendors are also just now setting up ways to do that securely. So to be able to look at your stuff in a big system and not be able to look at other customers' information, that's one of those things that being able to wall those off, and I think that's just starting right now. So I don't think it's customers demanding it just as much as providers starting to offer it.
No, my personal opinion is it's the dashboard. That's what I think they'll probably be hitting you up for or looking for if you haven't provided it already. It's a dashboard that and probably with the metrics that they want to see, maybe more so than what you want to provide. I mean, something that really can work for them. So it's probably a combination of both what you give them and something that they can also mash into with their numbers to determine what really works for them, as opposed to looking at two dashboards, right? I mean, if you're going to give them one and they're going to come up with one on their own, they probably would rather see it in something that's combined. So there's probably a mashup of there somewhere.
Thank you, gentlemen. This has been very insightful. When do you expect the full report to be completed, and where can we find it?
This fall, the Uptown Street Journal.
Thank you.
Just put a deadline on that. I hope we can meet it. Got one in the back there. Is that Mr. Height? Yes, it is. That's going to be an exciting question.
Yeah, maybe. What about from a security aspect? If you're adding a new network, if you're adding agents onto systems, has anybody talked at all about potential security issues with that?
Didn't really come up, so to speak, as much as you would think, I guess. Maybe that's probably a very good point. That's somewhat that everyone should think about. Because in all cases, I think, in order to get all the data you want and integrated, you're going to have to probably run it on your network, so to speak, as opposed to just a separate network from everything, because you do want to be able to pull in like utilization data, stuff like that. You're not going to want to have this out on us. It's going to be very cumbersome to do if you have a separate network that's just running all this other stuff. So it's a great point and something that we really didn't spend a lot of time talking about.
And there are vendors out there selling it as a SaaS product, right? You don't have that much installed that it's run on their equipment, that it's run on their system. So buying DCIM as a service. So that's a security concern. It's definitely something that I'd hope those folks are addressing. All right. I think time's up. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.